Thank you, Sam. In May 1693, a townswoman named Sabina was brought before the Kleczew's town court in eastern part of Greater Poland Voivodeship. She was accused of witchcraft and quickly interrogated by the judges, at which point she started to name other alleged witches from both Kleczew and the surrounding villages. Because of her denunciations, two more women from Kleczew were quickly put on trial accused of witchcraft: Maruszka Mruczykotka and Kurkowa. It was the beginning of one of the very last great witch trials in the region of Kleczew. Most of the trial followed a well-worn pattern familiar to Kleczew judges for decades. Both Mruczykotka and Kurkowa denounced other women, and under interrogation and torture, they began to confess to the most hideous crimes. Mruczykotka supposedly flew to Bald Mountain, was married with a devil named Jasiek, which is the Polish derivative of Jan, that means John, and had sex with him, for he was supposedly to be cold. What's more, she claimed to have killed one or two children by poisoning them, as well as poisoning at least one peasant. Sabina also supposedly flew to Bald Mountain, where she made an apostasy and was married with the devil named Jan, while Kurkowa supposedly made her husband blind with a special powder that she had received from her mother. At this point, however, the familiar pattern of a witchcraft trial began to break down. While describing Sabbaths that three of them allegedly attended, they mentioned a few men whose actions seemed suspicious to the judges. One, Scottish of Słaboszewek, was alleged to have appeared one day on the Sabbath and brought with him a shirt, boots, and żupan, that means an outer garment worn by the nobles, of the noble whom he served to, supposedly to bewitch him. Concerned judges decided to bring these men before the court as their jurisdiction allowed them to. Their suspicions proved to be right. They were not mere passive observers of the events that took place on the Sabbaths, nor were they idle musicians. It turned out that these men practiced witchcraft just like the accused women. During the interrogation under torture, one Mateusz Kaczmarek confessed that he supposedly flew to Bald Mountain, where he was married with the she-devil named Hanka. To his disappointment, the relationship did not evolve well, because Hanka turned out to be cold and unpleasant in direct contact. The same was also true about Theodor, or so-called a boy from Słaboszewek, who further confessed to abusing his own brother, Jarek. One day he put an ant in his ear, which Jarek could not read or kill in any way, suffering unspeakable torment for a full 3 days. For their crimes, all 5 of them were burned at the stakes. The cited trial is one of only 3 witchcraft cases from the region of Kleczew, in which men acted as defendants. Kleczew was a region which in the 17th and early 18th centuries was an arena of one of the largest witch hunts in Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In a little over a century, over 50 witch trials occurred there with nearly 120 defendants. The uniqueness of these 3 trials alone merits a closer look, for through them we gain a better insight into the qualities that a person who practiced witchcraft was imagined to possess. In this lecture, I will also cite numerous examples from other countries which demonstrate that associating only women with witchcraft, as we often do so, proves false, as all over Europe men were also accused. For a very long time, the issue of men accused of witchcraft was completely overlooked by Polish and European historiography. It was assumed that, as Polish historian Jacek Wijaczka rightly points out, here's a quotation, they took part only in the persecution of women accused of witchcraft, as judges, accusers, executioners, and witnesses, and were not themselves accused or tried. End of quote. Today we know that such a view was wrong. Men accounted for about 20% of European witch hunt victims, and in some areas, such as the Muscovy, they even outnumbered the accused women. Nevertheless, the historiography of witchcraft trials for a long time overlooked male victims of the witch hunt, thus subscribing to the claims of Heinrich Kramer, author of the notorious Malleus Maleficarum, who also minimized the participation of men in the crime of witchcraft. For a Dominican raised on anti-heretical texts, who spent most of his clerical life in polemics with the Waldens, the heresy of witchcraft was a feminine crime, as much as the heresy of the Waldensians was a masculine one. Nonetheless, early modern European culture permitted the existence of sorcerers, taking a bloody toll in some areas of Europe. The first major and meticulously researched study on men accused of witchcraft in Central Europe was a book titled Men as Witch, Male Witches in Central Europe by Rolf Schulte. It is worth noting that Schulte's work, though in theory devoted to the region of Central Europe, in reality concerns only German-speaking lands. In the early modern period, this consisted of the Holy Roman Empire. Therefore, the book ignores not only the vast territories of the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Hungary, but also those territories that were part of the empire, but used different languages, Czech or Slovakian. In the book, Schulte proposed four main theories regarding who the men accused of witchcraft were and under what circumstances they came before the courts. In this lecture, I will analyze in detail all four theories presented by Schulte and compare them with Polish archival sources to see to what extent those hypotheses are defensible in relation to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The central points of reference here are the 17th and 18th century criminal records of the town court of Kleczew, supplemented by information gathered in the extensive Polish witch trials database edited by Michael Ostling, as well as papers and books by Małgorzata Pilaszek, Kateryna Dysa, and Jacek Fijaczka. As previously noted, Rolf Schulte proposed in his work four theories about the men accused of witchcraft and the circumstances that surrounded the accusations. They presented as follows. First, the relationship theory. Men who were accused of witchcraft were closely related to women who were accused as witches, and therefore were somewhat collateral losses of the witch hunt process. Second theory, so-called the mass trial theory. Men were more often accused in great mass trials, which were characterized by a long chain of accusations and denunciations, during which the female witch stereotype broke down. The third theory, so-called the difference theory, men weren't accused of the same witchcraft crimes that women were. And finally, the fourth one, heresy theory, men were accused of witchcraft in those territories where witchcraft was linked with the crime of heresy rather than harming. Let's begin our elaboration with the mass trial theory. This is easy enough to verify since Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth didn't witness as many great witch trials as the Holy Roman Empire described by Schulte and other scholars. In 1972, Eric Middleford argued that the longer witch trials in certain regions occurred, the more probable it was for men to be accused of witchcraft. According to his claim, the longer the witch trials occurred, the bigger they became, with more people executed as a result. During this process, the stereotype of the witch figure as an old, hideous woman weakened, and as a result, when trials became mass trials, Middleford classified this as those with at least 20 executions, local communities began to leave behind old prejudice, instead panicking, accusing and executing anyone who was only slightly suspected of witchcraft. As Schulte claims, the methodology used by Middleford has three major flaws. Firstly, based only on the criterion of executions, Middleford classified trials which only resulted in a few deaths as small, even when they started with a great number of accused people. Secondly, the decision to classify some trials as great and others as independent or small doesn't account for the for the time perspective. Which trials were extended in time, and though at first some of them might seem to be fully independent from the others, they might be linked by similar or even the very same group of judges. Finally, further to the preceding arguments, due to the remoteness in time and the mechanism of denunciations, it is often very hard to define if this or that trial was linked with others and if it should or should not be counted as part of the same witch hunt wave. It's worth noting that in Polish conditions, this is even more problematic because of the poverty and dispersion of early modern archival records. As aforementioned, one must be greatly cautious while comparing Polish and German witch trials, especially when it concerns the number of accused and executed people. Middleford's distinction of witch trials as small, that means 1 to 3 executions, middle or small witch panic, 4 to 19 executions, and the great one or great witch panic with 20 or more executions, cannot be used to describe the size of the witch trials outside the borders of the Holy Roman Empire. Meticulous archival research conducted over the years has shown that just over 3,800 people were tried for witchcraft in Scotland, of whom sentences are known for 300 and only 5 of them. Two-thirds of them were executed, which the authors of the study consider to be representative for the rest of the archival sources. As for Hungary, we know of about 3,300 defendants accused of witchcraft in about 2,300 trials, with less than 2 accusations per one trial, of whom only some 700 were sentenced to death. In the case of the number of people sentenced to death, the Hungarian historians point out that the surviving records are often incomplete and often do not contain the verdict sentence. It is estimated that about 2,000 people were tried for witchcraft in England, of whom between 300 and 500 were sentenced to death. And in Finland, which was part of Sweden during the 16th through 18th centuries, there were about 710 trials, during which some 109 people were sentenced to death. What is interesting in that in the latter case, men definitely dominated among those accused and found guilty. It was only at the apogee of Finnish witch trials that the traditional image of the male sorcerer collapsed and the number of women accused of witchcraft increased, but overall never exceeded the number of men brought to trial. The number of executions assumed by Middleford for each type of witch trials does not reflect the reality outside of the Holy Roman Empire. I argue that in the case of the Commonwealth, as small witch trials, and also as the most dominant one, we shall classify the cases in which 1 or 2 people were effectively accused, not executed, but accused of witchcraft. As middle trials, we can accept those in which 3 or 4 people were effectively accused, while every trial with 5 or more effective accusations shall be classified as great. For the purposes of this talk, I will use the model I borrowed from Middleford. However, I'll modify it, adjusting to this Polish reality. I use, therefore, the distinction of small, middle, and great cases. However, I determine the number of accused people based on the common motive of the crime or people who took part in the trial, witnesses and the accused. It needs to be stressed here. My values relate to the cases and not the trials. According to this criteria, one case could be constituted of 2 or more smaller trials, never, however, otherwise. I am fully aware that my model isn't ideal, but I believe that it serves much better than Middleford's one, and it allows to show if men were, as Middleford once had stated, accused of witchcraft only in the mass trials, during which the stereotype of the old female witch had broken down. With such criteria, the situation in the region of Kleczew was as follows. Between 1624 and 1738, Kleczew's town court led circa 42 cases, during which about 123 people were accused of witchcraft. Those 42 cases can be divided as follows: 38 small, 2 middle, and 2 large cases. As Tomasz Wiślicz once rightly stated, in this number we can count only 3 men effectively accused of witchcraft, whom, when we compare them to almost 120 women, could go potentially unnoticed. Does this represent a percentage representative for the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth at the time? Definitely not. During an extensive archival query conducted more than 15 years ago, Małgorzata Pilaszek was able to identify 1,316 specific individuals accused of witchcraft, 142 of whom were men. That means 10.6%. Despite the very small percentage of men accused of witchcraft in the region of Kleczew, it is important to note what proportion of them were accused during the great cases. If we believe in the claims of Middleford, it is exactly where we should find them. And indeed, all 3 of them were accused during the 2 great cases, which happened just after the great witch persecution that was led by Wojciech Breza in 1680s. For the low number of men accused of witchcraft in the region of Kleczew, as well as the overall low number of great witchcraft cases, may lead to the danger of underestimation and overinterpretation, it is worth looking closer at those 3 accusations, especially since we know only so little of them from other regions of the Commonwealth. Firstly, there are circumstances that led to those 3 men being accused of witchcraft and eventually executed at the stake and are striking. While in the first case in 1693, both men were accused at the very advanced stage of the trial, and also both were denounced by women who were originally accused of witchcraft in this case. Therefore, we can see here the similarities with the cases elaborated by Middleford. The second one, in 1698, had a different character altogether. Kazimierz Ślosarek, who was executed during this case, wasn't accused of witchcraft by previously accused women. The reality was the complete opposite. It was him who was originally accused of witchcraft, and it is because of his testimony, which he made under torture, that other people, that mean women, were accused of witchcraft, which quickly turned a small case into a great one. When we look at the records from other towns of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, we will clearly see that the mass trial theory is even weaker than in the case of Kleczew. Indeed, the records show that men were often accused of witchcraft in trials where they were the only defendants. As an example, let us consider the cases described by Małgorzata Pilaszek. In 1731, a town court in Grabowiec heard the case of Marcin Strzemecki, who was accused by his master of threatening him with witchcraft and of armed ambush. In 1747, beekeepers from the village of Bagnówka near Białystok suspected one of the men in their midst of witchcraft. In 1654, a town court in Zbąszynek tried a certain Adam Jarpianek from the village Nowa Wieś, who was accused of giving himself to the devil, using weather magic, and participating in sabbaths. It is worth mentioning a trial rich in details from Jarocin, which was discovered a few years ago by Jacek Wijaczka. In this trial, the accused sorcerer was said to have caused a lot of problems for the local court, including by using sorcery to throw off and entangle the knots with which the local authorities tried to entangle him for the duration of the trial and thus breaking free. These examples can be supplemented by the data collected by Michael Ostling. In his database, we can find information on thousands of men tried for witchcraft, but most of them stood trial in small or at most medium-sized cases. For example, Grzegorz Jarmus, who was tried in 1633 in the village of Wola Żarczycka, was accused alongside his wife. Grzegorz Dubeltrain, accused in 1738 in Wągrowiec, who was subjected to a water ordeal at his own request, resulting in his death, was the only defendant in the case there. The same was true of Jan Kort, tried in Wągrowiec in 1727. Michał Świtała, who was sentenced to the stake in 1723 by the same court, was tried alongside his wife, and Jan Wilczek, tried in 1693 in Rogi and sentenced to flogging, was the only defendant in the case. An interesting addition to these examples is the case of a man from neighborhood of Kleczew who did not stand trial for witchcraft, but rather for arson, and denounced his own wife of being a witch in a desperate attempt to dilute responsibility for the crime he committed. Men who were accused in the great witch trials are much harder to find. Above, I mentioned two such cases from the region of Kleczew. Among the men accused in great trials was Jan Szczecina, who was accused before the town court in Turek along with 5 women. All 6 were found guilty, but only Jan was sentenced to banishment. All 5 women were burned at the stakes. As we can see then, it wasn't always necessarily the case that men were only accused during the great witchcraft cases. Sometimes they could be accused during the small cases, sometimes even originally being the only accused, which might then, though not always, evolve into middle or great trials. The difference theory enlisted by Schulte can be partially supported by the source material from Kleczew, but not in the very sense that Schulte argues. For men's testimonies in the cases of witchcraft are scarce, it is clear that local communities imagined the magical activities of male and female witches in a similar way. When interrogated under torture, Fyodor, a boy from the village Słaboszewek, testified that he had used the magic poison to kill a man and attacked his own brother by putting in his ear a living ant, which caused painful headaches. Another accused male witch, Mateusz, testified that with the help of his demonic she-lover, he had destroyed the crops in the fields. And lastly, Kazimierz Ślosarek, whose testimonies and denunciation had started the Great Witchcraft case in 1698. Though he didn't admit to practicing maleficium, he was accused of being a male witch by the woman who was previously denounced by him, and with this label he was eventually executed at the stake. Jacek Wijaczka argues that Joachim Gutejar and Jan Dirikens, who were tried for witchcraft, were accused of similar crimes as female witches, destroying crops, sending down weeds on the fields, etc. Western historians also come to similar conclusions, noting that it was not uncommon for men accused of witchcraft to be feminized in the eyes of judges and accusers, and to be treated less like men and more like women. There was, however, one striking difference between men and women accused of witchcraft. Men described imagined events during Sabbaths in vastly different ways to female witches, and this is the place where difference theory can be in some way applied. One of the main elements of imagined sabbaths, both in Poland and in Kleczew, were supposedly orgiastic sexual relationships between humans and devils or demons. This formed a solid element of Polish beliefs when it came to the motive of sabbaths, one of the components of the so-called cumulative concept of witchcraft. No matter what the supposed cost of one's participation in such a meeting, she or he was automatically suspected of sexual intercourse with male, in the case of women, or female devils, in the case of men. It is striking, however, that women were always much more restrained in admitting such guilt than men. A few years ago, Michael Ostling stressed this issue when addressing Polish witch trials testimonies involving the narration about sex with devils. Uh, Here's the quote. When Polish accused witches under torture confessed relatively quickly to the crimes of witchcraft, but made every attempt to deny the accusation of diabolical sex, or, if that failed, to make clear that it was unwilling, undesired, and painful. They were staking their claim to a partial share of the honor they had lost through the process of the trial. At this point in the proceedings, when such confessions were made, there was usually no possibility at all that the accused would escape death at the stake. They could still, however, avoid declaring themselves to be whores. End of quote. It was as such with women from Kleczew and its neighbor villages. The sexual intercourse with the devil, if it was mentioned at all, appeared only in the very advanced stages of the case. Even then, however, these descriptions were very brief and often conditional. Women interrogated during torture admitted sometimes that they had intercourse with the devil, but quickly caveated their descriptions with the statement that they took no pleasure in it, or that they were married with this or that devil by other witches, and that they only had sexual intercourse with him in the manner a wife is inclined to have sexual intercourse with her husband. Maybe I'll omitted the examples here. Uh, okay, it wasn't the case, however, when it came to the testimonies of male witches and sorcerers. Nowhere in the Polish records can we find evidence that men argue that their sexual relationships were unpleasant or painful, nor that they were forced to have sex with female demons. On the contrary, for men, sex with the she-devils was often recorded as pleasant and satisfying. I know I know of only one record in which a man testifies that his devil lover was caught, but even he never complained beyond that. These findings clearly show that the difference between male and female witches didn't lie in their imagined magical activities, but in their attitude towards sexual intercourse. Women accused of practicing witchcraft, when it came to the testimonies about sexual intercourse with devils, tried to do everything to preserve their good name, since women's honor was strictly linked with their sexuality. Even during interrogation, accused of witchcraft and the most horrible abominations, they mostly stated that they didn't willingly give themselves to the devils, and even when they did, they stressed that they did only out of marital obligations. The analysis of these two theories leads us directly to the relationship theory. As was already stated, none of the men from the region of Kleczew effectively accused of witchcraft were in any way related to other witches. For the rest of the Polish lands, the results are not much higher. As of June of 2025, I was able to find only a handful of such accusations in Michael Osling's database. One of them was that of Michał Maksimowicz, accused and tried in 1706 in Kowel, along with his wife, whose name is unknown to us today. Both were acquitted. The second case is the aforementioned Jan Szczecina, whose wife Jadwiga was accused of witchcraft in the same case. The third and the last case of this type I found was one Wawrzyniec, co-accused of witchcraft in Poznań in 1669 with his mother Zofia Papierniczanka. But what's even more important, as I pointed out before, in Kleczew's crime register, there were also men that were related to female witches, sorry, that supposedly went to sabbaths and sometimes were seen to support their wives' nefarious activities, but were not accused of witchcraft and were not punished in any way. And the only prerequisite for not bringing them to the court was their supposed bewitching by female witches. Unfortunately, we don't have enough examples from Poland to verify the last one theory, the heresy theory. For we know of a few cases of men accused of witchcraft in western parts of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. There are too little of them to draw a decisive conclusion. It is still worth noting, however, that a similar situation could be observed in Ukraine, which was much less varied in terms of confessions than somewhere like Greater Poland, for example, and that the highest percentage of men accused of witchcraft in this part of Europe was in Muscovy, which was homogeneous in terms of religion. In this last case, however, research led by Valery Kivelson has shown that the basis of the witch hunt there was quite different than in other parts of Europe. Its background was primarily politics, in which women, for cultural reasons, were not involved. Thus, the above lack of application of Schultz and Middelford hypotheses, which were supposed to concern Central and Eastern Europe, to the Polish material necessarily mean that the case of Polish men accused of witchcraft in the early modern period had no equivalent anywhere else in Europe? Not necessarily. For there are other models, sometimes applied to Western Europe, which may even fit the Polish reality better than those created on the basis of records from the eastern and central lands of the Holy Roman Empire. The phenomenon of men accused of witchcraft was approached in a multifaceted manner by Rita Woltmer, who was focused her study on the region delineated by the Rhine, Meuse, and Moselle rivers in today's German, Luxembourg, French borderlands. As in the case of Poland presented in this talk, Woltmer also found that the association between people accused of witchcraft increased the chances of persecution only slightly, too little to make it a rule. What's more, Woltmer points out that if such a relationship caused more people to be brought before courts, relatives, household members, servants, etc., then from a gender perspective, it worked both ways. It was just as well that a woman, wife, a mother, or a daughter could stand trial accused of being a witch because of her close relationship with the tried or convicted sorcerer, as a man because of his close relationship with a woman accused of witchcraft. This seems to fit much better to Poland than the hypothesis made by Schulte and Middelford. As a second group of men accused of witchcraft, Woltmer points to young men, often boys, including shepherds but also sons of rich peasants, attending sabbaths often because they were supposedly kidnapped by witches. This group also fits much better with the Polish records than the proposals of Schulte and Middelford. The example here would be two young boys from Słaboszewek, which I mentioned already a few times on this talk. It seems that of the men who were supposed to participate in the alleged sabbaths, only those who were outside of the jurisdiction of this or that court were not tried in Poland. In the case of Kleczew, there are many such cases, especially from the time of the Great Witch Hunt organized in the late 1680s and early 1690s by Wojciech Breza. In the Rhine-Meuse-Moselle region, men who posed some degree of economic threat to their fellow beekeepers were also accused of to their fellow professionals, were also accused of witchcraft. This again corresponds with the examples cited above, including the beekeepers of Bagnówka, who in the mid-18th century accused one of the men in their circle of helping himself to bees with witchcraft. The fourth category singled out by Woltmer were men who were known for their non-normative behavior, especially sexual ones, such as adultery, sodomy, bestiality, and incest. This group is absent in Kleczew's records because these crimes were tried from separate legal articles, and the suggestion of witchcraft never appeared in them. The last two groups of men accused of witchcraft, singled out by Rita Woltmer, were directly related to Jesuit missions in the villages and include priests who kept concubines or engaged in superstitious activities. I am not aware of any such cases either from Kleczew or any other Polish courts. Perhaps this should be put down to the lower level of confessionalization of the Polish lands in early modern period and the general superficiality of Christianity among the Polish people at the time. It seems therefore that the typical man accused of witchcraft in Poland is far from represented by Schulte and Middelford. More often he was not associated with women accused of witchcraft than he was. Not only did he not appear exclusively in large witch trials, but he even appeared in them less frequently than in small and medium ones, where he appeared as the only one or one of the only few defendants with whom the whole case began. Once he stood accused of witchcraft, it was imagined that his activities were no different from those of female witches. As in the case of women, men were believed to be equally destructive and focused on tormenting people and depriving them of their health. The only differences between women and men accused of witchcraft in Poland seemed to run only along the lines of how representatives of both sexes approached the issue of describing sexual intercourse with the devil imposed on them by the demonological discourse. Women approached the subject cautiously, masking themselves and hiding the fact that they did admittedly mate with the devil, but did so only as a result of their marital duties, while men whose honor was less connected with their sexuality had no need to make similar reservations. Finally, such men often came from the countryside and were alleged to be musicians at sabbaths or were accused by fellow artisans of accusing sorcery in their work to improve their performance, which meant that their own production and profits were diminished due to the logic of limited goods, which was common in the thinking of the time. Thank you.